Okay. So recently, a radio talk show and political analyst named Garland Nixon, who's based in D.C., caused quite a stir in the international media after what I consider a fairly innocuous tweet that satirically lambasted the Biden administration's policy over Taiwan. He wrote on Twitter, quote, "Breaking news. White House insiders leaked that when asked if there could be any greater disaster than the neocon Ukraine project, President Biden responded, quote, wait until you see our plan for the destruction of Taiwan." Pretty bold stuff. Now, as of writing our script for this show, the tweet had nearly 500,000 views, and it even spawned an editorial in the Taipei Times entitled "Cognitive Warfare is No Joke." And the paper made this assertion because Mr. Nixon's tweet was shared by a former member of the KMT, which is the current opposition party in Taiwan's local parliament, but was the ruling party for several decades. Even Taiwan's so-called Ministry of Foreign Affairs formally responded to the incident, and the office said as follows. Relevant domestic political parties quoted U.S. internet tweets saying that the White House had a plan to, quote, destroy Taiwan. Regarding the plan, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs further explained that the so-called famous host in Washington, D.C., quoted by the person actually belongs to the Russian state media, Radio Sputnik, is headquartered in Russia, and is part of the Russian state media Rossiya Сегодня group. Radio Sputnik was established according to the executive order of the Russian president and is owned by the Russian government. Its predecessor was the Russian official media Voice of Russia and RIA Novosti. Radio Sputnik has long been an official Russian propaganda tool, it says. As early as 2019, a U.S. court ruled that its radio station, WZHF-AM, is a Russian government agent and must be registered with the U.S. Department of Justice in accordance with the Foreign Agents Registration Act. The Rossiya Сегодня group was even sanctioned by the Canadian government in 2022 for spreading false information during the Russia-Ukraine war. Not only does the host belong to the Russian official media, but his personal account is also filled with all kinds of sensational and insulting posts about the U.S. government, which is obviously not a normal and reliable source of news. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs once again calls on specific individuals to shoulder their due social responsibilities and not to deliberately spread unverified and false information to mislead the public and undermine the, quote, Taiwan-U.S. partnership. Now, first of all, let's give Garland some credit here. After looking at his LinkedIn profile, we found that he's worked as a radio host and political analyst for WPFW Radio, a talk and jazz community radio station serving the greater Washington, D.C. metropolitan area for over 16 years, and he still works there. Garland also worked for 4 years as an adjunct professor at a local community college in the D.C. area, teaching criminal justice as he's a former police officer. And according to his About Me page, Garland also currently serves on the ACLU's national board. He has worked in the media since 1998, appearing on local radio and television in Baltimore, Washington, D.C., and national television in New York. He has made numerous appearances on NPR. Garland was a weekly panelist on the Fox Business News national TV show Follow the Money with Eric Bolling from 2010 to 2012. Garland currently hosts the weekly radio show on WPFW 89.3 FM in Washington, D.C., and makes regular appearances as a Democratic strategist on the Fox News channel. So, really, Garland is a pretty mainstream guy by any account, and as far as I'm aware, he works at Sputnik as sort of a side gig, and also, to my knowledge, he hasn't worked there for many years. He probably uses that platform to say things that he otherwise couldn't say on mainstream U.S. media, and I personally don't fault him for that because I also do the same. I have a column, for example, at RT. I would say that he certainly doesn't belong to Sputnik or the Russian state, for that matter. He definitely isn't based in Russia. So to reduce him to a foreign agent is unfair, in my opinion. Not only that, but the apparent drivel on his account that you can see is a mixture of satire that I think wouldn't be out of place in publications like The Onion or just any kind of level-headed criticism of U.S. foreign policy. And by the way, in case Taiwan local officials didn't get the joke is that Ukraine is a U.S. proxy conflict that in no way, shape, or form benefits the local population of that country. It has, in fact, left it in utter destitution, as we all see. Here in Prague, we have many Ukrainian refugees that have come from the war. And that is exactly why it's funny. Because it's something Biden might have actually said behind closed doors. And if you don't believe that, this is actually what some people in Washington want for Taiwan in the future. Just have a look at this. So, for example, some U.S. military academics have actually suggested that Taiwan should adopt a, quote, broken nest strategy in case of reunification with the Chinese mainland. One report quoting a paper in the U.S. Army War College's quarterly academic journal Parameters said that Taiwan should destroy its semiconductor chip technology if forced to reunite with Beijing. In a talk, members of the highly influential Center for Strategic and International Studies, called the CSIS, said that in a war game they conducted, local Taiwan forces must fight mainland China and not settle for peace. And the U.S. must directly engage China in combat. Moreover, they said that they expect the U.S. armed forces to destroy Taiwan's local infrastructure in case they end up loosening the conflict with China. They also want to provide the island with small, low-cost, and easily usable weapons, suggesting that many Taiwan residents would become conscripted soldiers, and we may assume die in a pointless conflict. Given this, it sounds like the island would literally become another Ukraine if the U.S. has its way, according to what people in Washington have even said themselves. So going back to Garland's original tweet and the response to it from Taipei and local Taiwan officials, how exactly is this cognitive warfare? How is it spreading disinformation if this is genuinely what's being discussed in Washington? That question I leave for you to mull yourself. In the meantime, here's the man himself, Garland Nixon, here to answer some questions for us. Вопрос. Garland, привет. Добро пожаловать в нашей программе. Говоришь по-русски? Как дела? Как погода?
Russia.
You don't understand Russian.
No, not at all.
That's quite peculiar for somebody that's been labeled basically a Russian asset by Taiwan's quote-unquote foreign ministry. So, Garland, you've created quite a story here on Twitter. The first question I have for you is, do you believe that you might have some potential lawsuits or something thrown your way? Or do you think that what you said was protected speech? Is it protected satire, hyperbolic statements that would normally be protected under freedom of speech?
Clearly, comedy and satire is protected under freedom of speech. For the government to even go after me for that, they would have to argue that it wasn't satire. They would have to argue that it was, there was a certain amount of truth to it, and I really don't think they want to have that argument. But yes, satire, comedy, clearly protected under the First Amendment.
Yeah, so I've seen on your Twitter a lot that you have this kind of breaking news spiel that you do, and it's obviously satirical, and I think just a cursory glance at your Twitter shows that this is just kind of a signature Garland kind of thing that you say breaking news and then some joke, but apparently people didn't do their due diligence in fact checking what you had said there, right?
Yeah, well, here's the issue with humor, period. Most comedians will tell you that the closer a joke is to reality, the funnier it is. And so people, that's why oftentimes people really enjoy like a celebrity roast, because at a celebrity roast, people will make jokes, but it's a joke that everyone knows there's a certain amount of credibility to the joke. And when I made that tweet, it was clearly satire. The satire was, no, Joe Biden didn't say that, and nobody of all people would leak it to me. But that anyone who looks at the dynamics in Ukraine and compares them to the dynamics in Taiwan would have to see a certain amount of alignment there and say, yeah, that's kind of funny, but not really, because if the people who live in Taiwan, if the citizens there look at the circumstances in Ukraine, they probably should have a credible fear that they could end up with a similar result.
Mm-hmm. So, given your extensive career in mainstream and community U.S. media outlets, how do you react to basically being reduced to a Russian propagandist or Russian agent by Taiwan local officials?
I find it humorous in the viewing it through the context of history. A few years back, I remember during the build up to the Iraq War. At that time, I wasn't on the radio, but I pushed back against it. The Iraq invasion. I'm not going to call it a war. It was an invasion and occupation of Iraq. I pushed back against that, and I said, "Well, we shouldn't do it." And I went into various reasons. And of course, what do you get? Oh, you're a Saddam Hussein supporter. The U.S. Dirty war in Syria. Well, you're an Assad supporter. So traditionally, when the U.S. comes up with its nefarious plan to either occupy, invade, or demonize a country and or the leader of that country, which usually go hand in hand, if you push back against those, you're labeled. They've got a name for you that implies that you're somehow captive to the authority of a foreign power. So, I find it laughable, but it's a way to discount and ignore the comments that are being made, and to belittle the person and pretend as though we shouldn't listen to Garland because fill in the blank. He's an Assad supporter, a Saddam lover, I don't know, an ISIS supporter, whatever the case may be, given the CIA narrative at any given point in history.
So you mentioned this before, but I would like to go a little bit more into the tweet specifically. So can you go into more detail about your tweet and why you wrote that? And do you really think that the United States government wants the people of Taiwan to suffer?
Well, I will end I will end with I will begin with the ending. Yes, I do. There's no question in my mind. I mean, let's look at Ukraine. Currently in Ukraine, what caused me, what motivated me to tweet that? A number of things. The most significant two being looking at Ukraine, recognizing that there was a point in time where the people, the ostensible government of Ukraine, had a peace deal with the Russians very early in the conflict, and the U.S. and U.K. operatives went in to nix the deal. So clearly, they wanted the people of Ukraine to continue to suffer and die. That's the first part. But then the last straw, or rather, I would say the true motivating factor was the U.S. attack on the Nord Stream pipeline, as illustrated or narrated, reported. How about that, by Seymour Hersh? I looked at that and I said, look, they are, causing their, Ukraine clearly is just the entire country is a tool for U.S. hegemony, U.S. imperialism, but their supposed ally gets the same treatment. They're just going to blow these people to smithereens and make them suffer. I put those two things together and created a satirical scenario wherein the U.S. Biden is joking, and I always do this. Breaking news. If you look at anybody that looks down my Twitter account, will see over and over and over. Breaking news: White House insiders leak that. Breaking news: Kremlin insiders leak that. Breaking news: EU insiders. I do that constantly. No one can look down the timeline of my tweet and not realize what I'm doing. But at any rate, when I saw that motivated me to write the satirical tweet in which Joe Biden openly um, expose the plan for the destruction of Taiwan. Now I say openly because anyone who follows this scenario already knows that's the plan. I mean, I will argue. That's what I'm saying. I am saying outright, openly, that it is glaringly obvious to me and to most reasonable analysts that the U.S. plans to use this small island as a blunt instrument to provoke China into a war, which, let's face it, if you've got an island here, which is part of China, and you try to push this island towards independence, then, and it flares up into a military engagement between two nuclear superpowers, that island's going to end up a pile of dust. Anyone who's sitting on that island that doesn't have sense enough to realize that the United States is setting them up to get, and I will use the term Ukraine as a verb, to get Ukrained, is incredibly naive. I find it shocking. It's kind of like a suicide cult to me for the citizens on the island to look at what's happening in Ukraine and not figure out that is what awaits us if we follow the dictates of the U.S. U.S. imperialism.
So, in my monologue before, I mentioned a few things that have come out of Washington. First of all, there's a report going around the media that the U.S. Army is encouraging, or at least mulling over, the fact that Taiwan should adapt some kind of strategy where, if there is a successful reunification of Taiwan with mainland China, that they destroy their semiconductor plants. And also, the Center for Strategic and International Studies also released their own war game model, where they said that they believe that the United States would destroy the infrastructure of Taiwan if there was a kinetic battle between China and the United States over Taiwan. So given that, I mean, do you see that this Ukraine comparison is actually valid? That the entire infrastructure of this island and the residents that are there would be destroyed.
Given that, I can understand why the quisling government of Taiwan would be upset over my tweet, because though it was intended to be satirical, unfortunately, the intent was behind it was satirical. But once you start digging into the reality and the U.S. plans for Taiwan, I didn't mean it to be reality. But the fact of the matter is, Joe Biden doesn't have to say that. And now, let me add this. When you look at the plans from the perspective of economics, the United States government is taking the TSMC, and they're making every attempt to actually move this plant to Arizona. Right, they're going to take the technology, they want to take the science, they want to take the the capabilities, the industrial capabilities, and move them to the United States. At that point, and here's what's obvious to me: once the United States has a version of TSMC here, think about it. Wouldn't it benefit them to destroy the original one? If they move it here, then they destroy the original one. They're the only ones that have it. So from the perspective of cornering the market, I can make a very strong argument from an economic perspective why it would benefit the U.S. government to basically steal TMC and blow up the original one. So I can make that argument, but I don't have to make that argument, because the U.S., the Pentagon has already made the argument. Now, they didn't say as clearly as I'm saying, oh yeah, we got to steal their technology and move their industrial capacity here first. They didn't have to say it; they did it. So it appears to me the plan was there. We moved TSMC here, and then we blow it up there. And the people of Taiwan, I'm just saying, if they don't understand that the plan for them is not going to work out very well for them, the few of them that will live through this, if any, won't have any jobs. They won't have any, industry. They will be reduced to, look at Ukraine. They will be reduced to Ukraine. It's the Ukrainization of Taiwan that's obviously and clearly the plan. I mean, let me add this. There are two superpowers that the U.S. sees as the U.S. neocons. They see as a challenge to their hegemony. And what are they doing with both of them? With Ukraine, they're pumping weapons into Ukraine. They're antagonizing Russia into attacking Ukraine, and now Ukraine's being turned into rubble. With Taiwan, they are pumping Taiwan full of weapons. They are antagonizing China into attacking Taiwan. It's clearly obvious that the same plan is there for Taiwan, except they have to steal their technology first of TSMC, and they've just about got that settled. So once they complete that, Taiwan is not not of great value to U.S. imperialism, other than as a method to provoke China into destroying it. So they can then use that as a excuse to say, okay, we've got to, now that China's destroyed Taiwan, I guess we're going to have to use some kind of sanctions to take China apart. In fact, I would even argue this: to some extent, it would not shock me if it were exactly the same as Ukraine. If basically what the neocons, the U.S. neocons did was said, all right, if you attack Taiwan, we're going to defend it. And then they provoke China into attacking Taiwan, and they say, well, we're not really going to offend it, but now that you've attacked it, we can use that as an excuse. Taiwan is just bait. That's what Taiwan is. I feel sorry for those people because if you've ever been fishing, you put bait on a hook. And when the fish bites the bait, you don't have a lot of concern over the bait. The bait was never there for its own interest. The bait was there to draw the fish in and be eaten or destroyed. Who cares?
Mm-hmm. So, you're kind of alluding to this, and you also mentioned this in your video explanation of the tweet about the U.S. being an unreliable partner. And I think we can see that not only in Ukraine, but also, for example, in Afghanistan. When Biden withdrew from Afghanistan, they left a lot of partners that they had worked with in Afghanistan up, to their fate, to the Taliban. You saw the video, of course, of people clinging on to the U.S. plane, falling off and dying. The dirty war in Syria that you mentioned. So, I think we can see it here as well in Europe. When the U.S. says that they are launching an economic war, for example, against Russia or China to try to deindustrialize these countries, that is not just meant to be against Russia or China. That also applies to Europe. Here in the Czech Republic, we're a very industrialized nation. A lot of our jobs here. In fact, the main employer of this country is Skoda Auto, which is an auto manufacturing company. And a lot of the economic growth models of countries here in Europe is to use cheap Russian gas, to then use to create machinery, heavy machinery, things like this, to export to the broader market. But now, because of the sanctions against Russia, these have been driven up in costs, making Europe less competitive and thus deindustrializing Europe. So, do you think that the U.S. is actually a reliable partner for Taiwan to defend the island, as you hinted at?
Well, it depends on what you mean by reliable. You are what your record says you are. You can rely on the United States to do what they've always done. And if you look at what happened throughout the Middle East, you look at what happened go all the way back to 1991 with the Kurds, where they assured the Kurds that if Saddam Hussein attacked the Kurds in northern Iraq, that they would defend them. Or rather, it was actually a little different. They said to the Kurds, if you rise up against Saddam, we will come in and help you take him out. The Kurds then rose up against Saddam, and the United States sat around and watched them get mowed down with helicopter gunships. They didn't. They just set them up and walked away. So you can rely on the U.S. all right. You can rely on them to look out for their own interests and to set you up to get destroyed and to walk away and not risk a single American life on your behalf. Now, from the perspective of Europe, here's the other part of it. I think we talk about the U.S. seeing Russia and China as potential challengers to their economic and military hegemony. The truth is, they also see Europe the same way. So while it may appear that it is an unintended consequence of the U.S. sanctions, U.S. inspired and directed sanctions against Russia, it may appear that it's an unintended consequence that Europe is economically spiraling out, downward and out of control. I would argue it's not. That the U.S. Targeted three potential adversaries, and that was China, Russia, and the EU. The EU is a gigantic market. It has potential utilizing Russian energy and commodities, and working with the Chinese, with this gigantic market that the Chinese has, and subsequently presenting an excellent and powerful market for Chinese industry. The three of these powers had the potential to rise together to astronomical heights, and the U.S. looked at it and said, "We got to take all three of them out. We'll start with whichever one we can." And so, to me, I would argue that the U.S. probably projected that the sanctions would destroy both Russia and Europe. They would make Europe not more, but totally reliant on the U.S. for energy and other commodities, and they would, kill two birds with one stone. Unfortunately for the Europeans, that's the only bird that got hit in the head with a rock, and the U.S. has pretty much doomed the European economy to an untimely demise, and they have actually entangled themselves in a tar pit that in the Ukraine conflict that they don't know how to get out of.
So, that's a really good point. And, we're seeing a lot of skepticism here in Europe. For example, in Prague, a few months ago, there was tens of thousands of people marching in Wenceslas Square in the center of Prague, marching for the resignation of their government to fundamentally change the foreign policy that they deem as destroying their way of life, making life unlivable. Inflation here is, above 15% year on year now. It's affecting everybody: groceries, rent, energy prices, and so on. Speaking to the Taiwanese, or I'm sorry, to Taiwan residents, speaking to these people, what do you have to say to them specifically about the record? As you mentioned, you define the U.S. by its record, its reliability. What is your message to Taiwan residents about the U.S. record and their reliability?
My message to the residents of Taiwan will be to you should do what the people of Europe did not do, and that is you should look out for your own interests. If you look at this, the Americans are looking out for their own interests at the expense of others, and you will be just another part of that puzzle where they advance their interest, or at least they'll believe they're advancing their interests. I would argue that what they're doing doesn't advance their interests, but they will have worked to advance their interests at your expense. The people of Taiwan need to consider what they can do for themselves, how they can address their own needs, because what the U.S. empire causes first and foremost is instability. They've caused instability in Ukraine an extent of to an existential level. They've created dramatic instability in the EU. Look where the US has been for the last 25, 30 years, in the war of terror, the Middle East instability. So they are going to cause dramatic instability on your island. You need to act in a manner that creates stability, and that is you have a superpower right next door. In order to maintain stability, you're going to have a stable relationship with China. You need to stabilize your relationship with China first and foremost. The United States is 7,000 miles away. They will leave you, they will set you up to be destroyed, and then they'll walk away, and they'll just in the same way. Look at this, they're setting Ukraine up to be destroyed. Ukraine's in the process of being destroyed. The United States, like a spoiled child, is getting bored with this toy, and now they have to go. They've decided, well, this toy is no fun anymore. We're going to go over to China, and we're going to go over to Taiwan, and we're going to provoke China. And when they're finished destabilizing that, your region of the world, off they'll go to another region of the world, or maybe they'll go to India or Africa or wherever the next destabilization project is. The people of Taiwan need to ensure that they act in a manner that stabilizes their relationship with China, so that they don't have to say, well, we'll be in the middle of a war between China and the United States, and we'll have to count on the United States to bail us out. Trust me, people of Taiwan, if that's your plan, it's not a good plan. And it has never worked out for people, countries, nations that have had that plan in the past, and it's not going to work out for you. That would be my message to the citizens of Taiwan.
Now, in the latest regional elections in Taiwan, the local elections, Tsai Ing-wen's Democratic Progressive Party suffered devastating loss to the KMT, and it was seen by many as this clarion call for peace, because the Democratic Progressive Party in Taiwan was trumping up the China threat, saying you need to vote for us, because if you don't vote for us, the threat against China will be greater. But people voted against this. In fact, because of so many corruption scandals within the party, because Tsai Ing-wen chose her own candidates without having a actual primary process, but rather handpicked candidates that she thought were going to be good, but there was a lot of scandals with these candidates. Do you see that as a trajectory that Taiwan residents, are actually catching on to this message, and that they don't actually believe that there is this dangerous China threat that's being trumped up by the DPP in Taiwan?
Yes, I do think that the people in Taiwan, that the citizens are waking up to the reality that they've been led down the path of destruction, and that if they continue down the path that has been set for them by the current leaders, they will get exactly what Ukraine has gotten, if not worse. All they need to do is look at the U.S.'s other allies. Look at Russia, right? I mean, excuse me. Look at Germany right now. Germany is in total disarray. The people are waking waking up to higher prices, to a future where they're deindustrialized, to a future where their jobs and their way of living and their lifestyle has been wiped out, that is spiraling downwards. They look at their leader after the United States attacks them. It's clear based on the evidence before we even heard from Seymour Hersh. The evidence was clear, but Seymour Hersh lays it out that the U.S. attacked their so-called ally. And the leader of Germany then proceeds to go to Washington and basically, I mean, I'll use it metaphorically, to shine the shoes of Joe Biden, to basically thank him for destroying uh, um, their infrastructure and join him in this mad quest to suppress China and to destabilize Asia. I think the people of Taiwan are waking up to the reality, and I think the people of Taiwan have to be very careful, because the U.S. empire will get desperate, understanding that the people of Taiwan are waking up and moving to act on their own behalf, and to act for their own safety. The people of Taiwan have to be very, very careful, because the U.S. empire could, act in an unpredictable way. But they need to move away from instability towards a stable relationship with a powerful nation that is technically they are part of. So they need to get away from the instability of the West, and they are in Asia. They have to deal with Asian issues, work for the stability of the Asian region, the Pacific region. They're in the Pacific region. No matter how they look at it, they need to work towards stability in their own region and not chaos.
Mm-hmm. So I've got some more questions here. Just as a little background, on March 1st, the U.S. Department of State approved a possible foreign military sale of $619 million to Taiwan Island. So on one hand, Secretary of State Antony Blinken in February alleged that Beijing was possibly considering providing lethal support to Russia, portraying the U.S. as the world's spokesperson for peace and justice. And then on the other hand, just weeks after that, Washington itself announced the new arms sale for Taiwan, which posed a severe threat to peace across the Taiwan Strait. China's Foreign Ministry of National Defense remarked on March 3rd. What do you make of this contradiction of Antony Blinken?
Certainly, this is the rules-based order. That's what it is. That is, the reality of the rules the rules-based international order, which is nothing more than a hierarchy. It's nothing more than international feudalism, where the U.S. says we are the class of nobility, and the European vassals of theirs, they're the commoners, and everyone else is peasants. And let's face it, in a feudal order, in a hierarchical order such as that, the noble class enjoys the prerogatives to do whatever they want, and the peasants can't. So the position of the U.S. is, because we are the class of nobility, because we're at the top of the hierarchy, we can do whatever we want. You can't do what we can do, because you're not at the position in the hierarchy that we are, and they're exercising what they believe is their position of superiority. And the problem is the other people around the world do not want to accept that hierarchy. So this is a battle. To me, the U.S. is pushing a hierarchical world order, where the rights are the rights that any given nation has are based on where they sit in this hierarchy, as opposed to I would say a Eurasian-based coalition of Russia and China and India and other countries that are pushing for for a world order based on universal rights, where everyone has the same expectation of rights, where you cannot say, I'm going to give weapons to this country, but you can't give weapons to that country, where you say, we have a international law, we have UN charter, and the decisions that we made are based on rules that affect all of us, not a hierarchical order. That's the challenge going on right now.
So how judicious is it for the U.S. to supply weapons to Taiwan region at a time when it is also deeply entrenched in the Russia-Ukraine war, where it is helping Ukraine with arms and other aids? Won't it put additional strain on the U.S. politically, military, and economically in the long run?
Well, it's a sign of desperation and irrationality. The U.S. is fighting against modernity. It's fighting against a reality of a changing world, a modern world in which there are various poles of power in the world, and in which the newer poles of power are not interested in hierarchy, and the U.S. doesn't know how to deal with it. It's kind of like a man who falls in the water and doesn't know how to swim. He reaches and grabs in desperation in every direction he can to hold on to something because he doesn't have a plan and he doesn't know what to do. So the United States is not operating off of a plan. They're operating out of desperation. They're reaching in every direction. And whether it's in Africa right now, the U.S. is upset and they're trying to force the Africans to bend to their will. The Middle East, all around the world is changing. There's not an emerging multipolar world. The multipolar world has emerged, and the U.S. is in desperation trying to deal with it. And it's like everywhere they look, every direction they look, this multipolarity pokes its head up, and so they can't do anything with the Europe to settle the European dilemma in a manner that benefits U.S. imperialism. So instead, they're going to try to start something new in China and hope that works. Right now, the plan is hope. As I said, it's like a drowning man in the water. His plan is hope. Just grab in every direction. Hopefully, I'll find something to pull me out. And that's where the U.S. is. But the world has changed, and there's no way out for the U.S.
So the next question is, a senior U.S. officer, Air Mobility Command Chief General Mike Minahan, recently created a stir by predicting a China-U.S. war in 2025 over their friction over Taiwan region. How credible is such a prediction, and what is your view about a looming war between China and the United States?
I think it can be avoided. I think that the U.S. One of two things. Out of desperation, I think the U.S. would probably prefer to provoke China into attacking Taiwan in the same way that they did with Ukraine, and allow Taiwan to be destroyed and not come in to save Taiwan, and then utilize that dynamic to then say, well, we're going to sanction them, sanction them, and that way they can decouple the European market from China, which would wipe them out once and for all. And then they can go ahead with their plan that isn't working with Russia because they don't know anything else to do. That's certainly one option. The other issue is, I think in order for that war to happen, China has to cooperate. And I don't think China's going to cooperate. Here's the way I see it. The U.S. is looking at it saying, if we don't go to war with China, or we don't settle this issue within the next 3 or 4 years, we lose, because China's going to be very powerful and all of these things. Well, if you say to me, Garland, if I don't fight you by next Thursday, I won't be able to beat you. I ain't fighting you by next Thursday. You've already told me how to win. The way to win is just wait till after Thursday. So when they say basically imply that if we don't fight China by a given time period, we're not going to be able to beat them, I suspect China's smart enough to say, well, I think we'll just wait till about 5 years after that time period, then we'll revisit this issue again. So I suspect that China is not stupid enough to take the bait. That China is smart enough to know what the U.S. is telling them is what everybody knows, and that is time is on China's side. And if time's on my side, there are various weapons I can use to win a battle without fighting a battle, and one of them is time. And if time is my most dynamic weapon and most effective weapon, that's the weapon I'm going to use. And time is China's weapon. The U.S. I suspect they're going to try to either declare that Taiwan's independent, or get Taiwan to declare their independence. There's something out of desperation to say, we've got to provoke China into taking a military act. But if China is wise enough, and I suspect they are, not to take the bait, all they have to do is wait this thing out and they win. Waiting is an easy one. If I'm China, I'd say, I'm going to give this thing 10 years. If I'm China, I'd just say, I'm going to give this thing 10 years. Things look kind of messy right now. Let's just give it 10 years and see how it works. They already know if they give it 10 years, they win.
Now, it also seems like the United States has known this for quite some time, because before this interview, you sent me a DM and you showed me a talk by another former U.S. official who I think it was like 1994 or something, but it was like 30 years ago.
They 2004.
2004. Okay, so it was the exact same prediction 20 years ago. So it seems that the United States has known that time, as you said, is on China's side for quite some time.
Right.
The final question I have for you here is, So the U.S. government has taken a series of steps to limit China's access to key semiconductor technologies and supply chains, while at the same time enhancing its collaboration with Taiwan-based TSMC, which you mentioned, one of the world's biggest chip makers. How do you look at the U.S. strategy of pitting Taiwanese enterprises to contain China?
Well, I think first and foremost, the U.S.'s plan is to steal TSMC from Taiwan because they don't. At this point, the United States doesn't is not educating their citizens properly. They're preying on their citizens who try to go to college and leaving them in lifelong debt after they get out of college. So the U.S., because they're not producing the technologically superior students that they need to produce in order to keep up with the technology of Taiwan and China. They're trying to simply steal Taiwan's technology, and they may or may have not been successful at it. I do think that what they're doing is, it's short-term gain. Okay, you're going to put China behind the eight ball a little bit in the short term, maybe for a few years, and you'll steal Taiwan's some of their technology. What you're also doing, if you look at what happened with Russia, 8 years ago, the United States put these dramatic sanctions on Russia in 2014, figuring we're going to hurt Russia. What they forced Russia to do was to learn how to create things on their own, how to feed themselves with, increase their output of foodstuffs and a number of other things that they needed to do to help themselves, so much so that it made them stronger. So I think in the short run, yes, it's going to be a little bit of a problem for China in catching up with their technology on chips. But in the long run, 5, 10 years from now, China will pass what the U.S. has stolen, because the U.S. is stealing TSMC's industrial and technological capacities. But can they continue in the direction that TSMC is continuing? I don't think they can. Maybe they can. I hope they can, to tell you the truth. I don't want to see the U.S. go down to nothing. But I think China's technological prowess is, to be quite frank, is one of the best in the world. And I think that they're going to be very successful. And 10 years from now, they'll look back and they'll thank the United States for putting them in a position to become the world's foremost chip maker. So that's what I think that happens in the long run. It helps China in the long run, in the same way that the sanctions helped Russia.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for talking to us today and for our first show, and really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Be happy to come back again.
Hey everybody, if you like this content, please smash that like button. Consider giving it a share. Please subscribe. It's just one button to press. And also, if you feel so inclined, please subscribe to our Patreon to support the page. Anything is appreciated. And we thank you so much for viewing this. And we'll get back to you next week. Thanks a lot.